Hello, I'm authorized to be here. I'm Mrs. Smith's hospice
Ma'am, we
nurse.
received a call about an intruder. I'm going to need you to step away from the patient and put your hands where I can see them.
My ID and credentials are right
The
here in
family
my
has
pocket.
given me keys.
All right.
I'm authorized to be here. I'm Mrs. Smith's hospice nurse. I've been caring for her for 6 months, Melissa Anderson said, standing perfectly still by her patient's bedside, the medication syringe still in her gloved hand. Ma'am, we received a call about an intruder. I'm going to need you to step away from the patient and put your hands where I can see them, Officer Wilson stated firmly, his right hand resting on his holstered weapon as he stepped further into the elegant Garden District home in New Orleans. My ID and credentials are right here in my pocket. The family has given me keys. I'm supposed to be here, Melissa explained, carefully setting down the syringe on the medical tray next to her 78-year-old patient, who watched the scene with growing confusion. Hands where we can see them first. We'll sort this out after we secure the scene, Officer Rodriguez demanded, moving to flank the other side of the room in what appeared to Melissa as an unnecessarily tactical approach to a healthcare worker in scrubs. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and be sure to subscribe so we can continue to cover more cases just like this. Melissa slowly raised her hands, the blue nitrile gloves stark against her dark skin, and took a measured step back from Mrs. Patricia Smith's bedside. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but 12 years of hospice nursing had taught her to maintain composure during crisis, though she'd never imagined the crisis would be aimed at her. Officer Wilson approached with quick, deliberate steps, his partner maintaining his position with an unbroken stare that made Melissa acutely aware of her vulnerability in this sprawling home where she had provided care for half a year. The medical bracelet on her wrist and the embroidered logo on her scrubs seemed suddenly insufficient proof of her legitimate presence, despite the familiar routine of her Tuesday evening medication administration that had brought her to this room at precisely 5:30 p.m., just as it had twice weekly since September. "That's my nurse. Why are you—" Mrs. Smith said weakly from her adjustable bed, her voice trailing as she struggled to project above the tension filling her bedroom. "Ma'am, please remain calm. We're just ensuring everyone's safety," Officer Rodriguez said without shifting his gaze from Melissa. The officer's dismissal of her patient's confirmation sent a wave of indignation through Melissa, but she suppressed it, knowing that showing any emotion might escalate the situation. Officer Wilson was now directly beside her, his 6-foot frame towering over her 5'4" stance, creating a physical intimidation that seemed intentional rather than incidental. The March evening light filtered through the plantation shutters, casting striped shadows across the medical equipment and family photos that clearly marked this as a home where someone was receiving professional care. Context that the officers seemed determined to ignore. "My nursing credentials are in my pocket, and Mrs. Smith's care plan with the family contact information is right there in that binder," Melissa explained calmly, nodding toward the blue medical binder that sat prominently on the bedside table. Officer Wilson made no move toward the binder, instead circling behind Melissa in what felt like a deliberate show of control. "I've been Mrs. Smith's hospice nurse for 6 months, and I have explicit permission from her family to be here," she continued, maintaining her professional tone despite the growing knot in her stomach. The patient monitor beeped steadily in the background, its medical rhythm a stark contrast to the unnecessary law enforcement intervention unfolding in the peaceful bedroom. "Turn around slowly and place your hands behind your back," Officer Wilson commanded, removing handcuffs from his belt with a metallic slide that seemed to echo in the bedroom. Disbelief washed over Melissa as she processed the directive. She was being treated as a criminal while performing essential health care in her patient's home. "This is standard procedure until we can verify who you are and why you're here," he added, though nothing about this approach felt standard to Melissa, who had encountered emergency personnel in patients' homes many times throughout her career. She complied carefully, turning with deliberate slowness to avoid any misinterpretation of her movements, the professionalism that defined her career now serving as her only shield in this unexpected confrontation. The cold metal of the handcuffs closed around her wrists with a definitive click that seemed to punctuate the humiliation now washing over her. "Please, she's my nurse." "Patricia." "My nurse," Mrs. Smith pleaded again from her bed, her frail voice carrying the confusion of someone witnessing an incomprehensible scene in her own bedroom. Officer Rodriguez finally glanced toward the elderly woman but made no meaningful acknowledgement of her statement, instead pulling out his radio to report that they had secured a subject at the location. Melissa stood with her hands now cuffed behind her back, the position making her uniform bunch uncomfortably and restricting the professional dignity she carried into every patient interaction. The indignity burned through her as Officer Wilson began rifling through her nursing bag without asking permission, dumping her organized medical supplies onto the table in a disorganized heap that would require careful reassembly before she could properly care for her patient. "What's this?" Officer Wilson asked sharply, holding up a prescription bottle of morphine that had been in the temperature-controlled section of her nursing bag. Melissa took a deep breath before answering, fighting to maintain her professional composure despite the growing sense of violation and racial targeting that was becoming impossible to ignore. "That's prescribed pain medication for Mrs. Smith's breakthrough pain. It's logged in her medication chart with the prescription number and dosing schedule," she explained, nodding toward the chart that hung at the foot of the bed. "Standard protocol for any hospice patient." Officer Wilson set the bottle down without checking the chart, continuing to sort through her supplies with the skeptical scrutiny of someone determined to find something incriminating rather than the organized tools of healthcare. "How did you get into this house?" Officer Rodriguez questioned from across the room, his tone suggesting Melissa's presence remained suspicious despite the medical equipment surrounding them and the patient's own recognition. Melissa shifted slightly, the handcuffs digging into her wrists as she answered. "The family gave me an access code and keys 6 months ago when they contracted with Bayou City Hospice Services. I'm here 3 times a week to administer medication and provide care while they're at their daughter's basketball game." The specificity of her answer, the routine of a family trusting their loved one's care to a dedicated professional, hung in the air, seemingly insufficient against whatever preconceptions had led these officers to handcuff a nurse at her patient's bedside. Mrs. Smith's monitoring equipment continued its rhythmic beeping, a medical metronome marking the minutes of care that Melissa was being prevented from providing to her increasingly distressed patient. "We'll need to see some ID and verification from your employer," Officer Wilson stated, as if this request was reasonable after already placing her in handcuffs. Melissa maintained her composure, though frustration threatened to crack her professional veneer as she responded, "My ID badge is attached to my scrubs, and my nursing license is in my wallet in my bag, the one you're currently searching." The pointed reminder of their premature restraint and search before establishing her identity seemed lost on the officer, who continued examining her belongings with unwarranted suspicion. Through the bedroom door, Melissa could see Officer Rodriguez moving through the living room, picking up family photos and examining them as if searching for visual evidence that would either confirm or deny her right to be present in this home where she had provided care for half a year. "Who else has access to this house?" Officer Rodriguez called from the living room, his question carrying an accusatory tone that suggested Melissa might be operating as part of some larger criminal enterprise. The absurdity of the question, asked of someone handcuffed while wearing scrubs and standing next to medical equipment, might have been laughable in another context, but in this moment it carried the weight of dangerous assumptions about who belonged in this upscale New Orleans neighborhood. The family members are listed in the care plan binder, along with emergency contacts, Mr. and Mrs. Taylor, their son Andre Taylor, and their daughter-in-law Lisa, Melissa answered, her voice steady despite the building pressure in her chest. The patient monitoring equipment showed Mrs. Smith's heart rate elevating, a direct physiological response to the stress of watching her caregiver treated like a criminal, yet neither officer seemed to register or care about the medical implications of their intrusion on a terminal patient's well-being. The front door opened with the familiar jingle of keys, followed by Andre Taylor's voice calling out, "Mom, we're back! How did everything go with—" His sentence cut short as he entered the living room and took in the scene, a police officer standing amid his mother's belongings, while another officer could be glimpsed in the bedroom doorway. Andre rushed forward, his wife Lisa close behind him, both still dressed in the casual attire they'd worn to their daughter's basketball game at the local high school. "What's happening here?" Andre demanded, his voice rising with immediate concern as he moved toward his mother's bedroom, where he stopped abruptly at the doorway. Lisa gasped audibly behind him as they both registered the sight of Melissa Anderson, their trusted hospice nurse of 6 months, standing handcuffed beside Mrs. Smith's bed while the elderly woman appeared increasingly distressed. "Sir, we responded to a call about a suspicious person entering this residence," Officer Wilson stated with a newfound professional tone that had been absent in his interaction with Melissa. Andre's expression shifted from confusion to outrage as he processed the scene, his gaze moving from Melissa's handcuffed wrists to his mother's anxious face. "This is Melissa Anderson, our mother's hospice nurse. She's been caring for my mother for over 6 months and has every right to be here," he stated emphatically, moving into the room with the confident authority of someone in their own home. The contrast between the officer's treatment of Melissa and their immediate deference to Andre, a difference that seemed clearly tied to racial dynamics rather than any legitimate security concern, hung in the air like a visible indictment of the system that had brought them to this moment. "We were simply following protocol after receiving a call about an unknown individual entering the residence," Officer Rodriguez explained, though his explanation seemed to wilt under Andre's incredulous stare. Lisa had moved to Mrs. Smith's bedside, checking the monitors and speaking soothingly to the elderly woman whose vital signs showed clear distress from the unnecessary confrontation. "You handcuffed our nurse while she was administering medication?" Lisa asked, her professional background as a hospital administrator evident in the precise cutting question that identified exactly how far beyond protocol this response had gone. Officer Wilson shifted his weight, suddenly appearing less certain of his position as he replied, "We needed to secure the scene until we could verify her identity and reason for being here. She has credentials, a uniform, medical equipment, and my mother recognizing her. What exactly required handcuffs?" Andre demanded, his voice controlled but carrying the unmistakable edge of someone witnessing an injustice too familiar to be dismissed as a misunderstanding. Melissa stood silently, the relief of the family's arrival tempered by the humiliation of being discovered in handcuffs like a criminal, rather than the healthcare professional they had entrusted with their loved one's care. Officer Rodriguez began a response about standard procedure when encountering unknown individuals in private residences, but his justification sounded hollow against the backdrop of medical equipment and the family's clear recognition of their nurse. The rationalization seemed to collapse further when Andre pointed out that they had called the non-emergency line just last month to update their security information with a list of healthcare providers authorized to enter their home. A proactive measure that should have prevented exactly this kind of incident. 3 days after the handcuffing incident, Melissa sat across from her attorney in the glass-walled conference room of Coleman and Partners law offices in downtown New Orleans, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that she hadn't actually sipped from. The body camera footage has been requested, but what's most compelling is the statement from the Taylor family and the patient care log showing your scheduled visit, attorney Danielle Coleman explained, sliding a folder across the polished table. Melissa nodded, still processing the events that had transformed her from a respected healthcare provider to a suspected intruder in the span of moments. A transformation that had left her waking up in cold sweats for 3 consecutive nights. The incident report filed by Officers Wilson and Rodriguez claimed they had reasonable suspicion based on a neighbor's call, but conveniently omitted their dismissal of Mrs. Smith's confirmation of Melissa's identity and their refusal to check her credentials before applying handcuffs. The department's initial response is that the officers were following protocol, but the patrol guidelines clearly state that identification verification should occur before restraint unless there's an immediate safety threat. Attorney Coleman continued, her finger tapping on the relevant section of the police procedural manual she had obtained. The clinical language of police procedures seemed inadequate to capture what had happened. The assumption of criminality applied to a black healthcare worker that would likely never have been applied to someone white in the same circumstances. Melissa finally set down her untouched coffee and spoke, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I need to understand if I can safely return to work. I have patients who depend on me, but I can't help them if officers might decide I don't." Look right, entering their homes. The professional concern for her patients, even after being humiliated and criminalized while caring for one, spoke to the dedication that had defined Melissa's 12-year nursing career, a dedication now threatened by the shadow of racial profiling. The community response has been significant. Attorney Coleman noted, gesturing to her computer screen, where local news coverage showed a gathering of healthcare workers outside the police precinct, many holding signs with messages like, "Nurses aren't criminals," and "Care providers demand respect." The New Orleans Healthcare Workers Association had issued a formal statement condemning the incident and calling for departmental accountability, while 3 city council members had publicly questioned the police response to a clearly identifiable healthcare worker performing her duties. Melissa felt a complex wave of emotions seeing the support, validation that the injustice was recognized, but also the weight of becoming an unwilling symbol in a larger struggle when all she had wanted was to provide compassionate care to her patients. The footage from Officer Wilson's body camera, which Attorney Coleman had just received that morning, showed Melissa calmly identifying herself as a nurse, while the officer repeatedly interrupted her explanations. A stark contrast to the report, claiming she had been evasive about her presence in the home. "I've spoken with the police commissioner's office, and they've requested a meeting tomorrow morning. Their rapid response suggests they recognize the serious nature of what occurred," Attorney Coleman said, closing the file containing the incident documentation. The administrative wheels were turning with unusual speed, driven by community pressure, clear procedural violations, and the irrefutable optics of handcuffing a uniformed healthcare worker at a patient's bedside. Melissa nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope that accountability might actually follow this incident, though it couldn't erase the moment when cold metal had closed around her wrists or the look of confusion on Mrs. Smith's face as she watched her nurse being treated like a criminal. The Taylor family had been unwavering in their support, filing their own complaint against the department and telling reporters that the incident revealed a dangerous pattern of assumptions about who belongs in certain neighborhoods, a pattern that Melissa had navigated throughout her career, but had never before resulted in such a direct confrontation with its institutional enforcement. 6 weeks after the handcuffing incident, Melissa Anderson walked confidently up the path to Mrs. Smith's Garden District home, her nursing bag over her shoulder and a new security clearance badge prominently displayed alongside her medical credentials. The department's internal investigation had concluded with a finding of improper detention procedure and failure to follow identification protocols, resulting in a 30-day suspension for Officer Wilson and mandatory retraining for Officer Rodriguez. Consequences that fell short of termination, but represented more accountability than many similar incidents had generated. More significantly, for Melissa's daily work, the New Orleans Police Department had implemented new training protocols specifically addressing interactions with healthcare workers and had established an expedited verification system that allowed healthcare providers to register their authorized presence in client homes. The procedural changes wouldn't eliminate the underlying biases that had led to the incident, but they created an additional layer of protection for the predominantly Black and brown healthcare workers who moved through affluent neighborhoods providing essential services. "How are you feeling today, Mrs. Smith?" Melissa asked as she entered the familiar bedroom, setting her nursing bag on the table that had been used to display her suspicious medical supplies 6 weeks earlier. The elderly woman smiled warmly, reaching a frail hand toward her nurse in a gesture that wordlessly communicated the trust that had weathered even the trauma of watching Melissa in handcuffs. The Taylor family had not only supported Melissa through the police department investigation, but had also become vocal advocates for the Healthcare Workers Protection Act, now moving through the state legislature, a bill that would establish clear protocols for law enforcement interactions with identified care providers and create penalties for unwarranted interference with medical care. Andre Taylor had testified at the legislative hearing just the previous week, describing how his mother's vital signs had been negatively impacted by the stress of watching her nurse detained, presenting the incident not just as a racial injustice, but as a direct threat to patient well-being. "The support group meets again on Thursday if you're interested," Lisa Taylor said as she brought fresh water for her mother, referring to the newly formed coalition of healthcare workers and allies that had emerged in response to Melissa's experience. Melissa nodded, feeling the weight of her unplanned advocacy role alongside her professional responsibilities, a dual burden she carried with the same grace that had helped her maintain composure even while being handcuffed at her patient's bedside. The incident had transformed her in ways she hadn't anticipated, pushing her to speak at community forums about the challenges faced by healthcare workers of color. and to consult on the department's new training curriculum addressing implicit bias and emergency response. Each of these additional responsibilities taxed her already limited time as a single mother working full shifts. Yet she recognized the importance of ensuring that her experience led to systemic changes rather than becoming just another undocumented incident in a long history of racial profiling. "I never thought my nursing degree would lead me to police reform work," Melissa remarked to Andre as she completed Mrs. Smith's care plan update in the family's sunlit kitchen later that afternoon. The civil rights attorney who had represented Melissa pro bono had called that morning with news that the Civilian Police Oversight Board had unanimously recommended departmental policy changes based on her case, changes that would affect how officers responded to calls about suspicious persons in residential neighborhoods. Officer Wilson and Rodriguez had issued formal apologies as part of their disciplinary process, though Melissa noted that neither had directly acknowledged the racial dynamics that had clearly influenced their approach to a black nurse in an affluent white neighborhood. The lasting impact of the incident extended beyond policy changes to Melissa's personal and professional life. From the community recognition that sometimes made her uncomfortable to the heightened awareness she carried into each new patient's home. Yet she had refused to let it diminish her commitment to compassionate care or her presence in spaces where she had every professional right to be. As she packed her nursing bag to leave, Mrs. Smith called out a gentle thank you that encompassed more than just the medical care, a recognition of Melissa's resilience in returning to this space where her dignity had been violated, continuing to provide essential care despite the trauma she had experienced while doing exactly that.